Herod the Great, a name that lives in infamy.
Paranoid, he was ruthless, he was vicious.
A usurper of a century-old dynasty, his Jewish subjects resented him as a puppet, installed to power by Rome.
He accepted Roman rule, giving up on Jewish national pride.
Accused of mass murder, Herod slipped into madness and disease, while those around him suffered the wrath of his paranoia.
He's always looking over his shoulder, wondering where the next uprising is going to come from.
Herod's trail of bloodshed often threatens to overshadow a lifetime of achievements.
There's no single individual who built more and who left more of a lasting mark than Herod did.
The story of Herod the Great is the story of Judea's ascent under Roman rule. King Herod ruled Judea from 37 BCE. With Roman support, his reign lasted to the turn of the millennium. When the threat of a newborn king arose, the biblical Gospel of Matthew accused Herod of slaughtering all Bethlehem's male infants.
Who wouldn't believe that Herod would try to prevent a new king of the Jews, a Messiah, from coming forth if he believed it was going to happen? And who would believe that this man would not hesitate to kill infants?
Herod eliminated many who were closest to him, assuring his grip on power. But was he truly responsible for his most famous act of brutality? The calamities of Herod's rule were recorded in Rome many years later. Flavius Josephus fought in the Jewish uprising of 66 CE, before scribing a history of the Jewish people, dedicating many pages to Herod the Great.
Josephus is an absolutely amazing Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century CE. And he provides us, for that period between the Hebrew scriptures and the rise of Christianity, an enormous amount of what we know about the political history and also the religious history. And as a result, he is the main figure on which we depend for understanding that period.
Vivid portrayal of battles, romantic scenes, erotic motivations, all of these things he introduces, and yet he never loses sight of his historian's mandate.
Josephus is by far our best authority on Herod, and he tells us about him in 2 of his works, The Antiquities of the Jews and The Jewish War. He doesn't like Herod very much, though, and that's one of the difficulties. He wants to tell us what a bad character Herod was.
Herod was never destined to be king of Judea, and the unlikely events that paved his ascent to the throne would blacken his name in the eyes of his subjects.
During the course of Herod's reign, he faced a number of challenges. One challenge was that his Jewish population did not like him. They viewed him as a usurper who had been appointed by an outside power, the Romans, to rule over them.
Devoid of royal blood, Herod's unconventional path to power began long before his birth. Before Herod's rule, the kingdom of Judea was controlled by the Hasmoneans, a dynasty that had battled outside powers to gain Jewish independence.
And so in the minds of many people, they were the great saviors of Judaism. They were the people who had fought off the foreign oppressors and established home rule.
Originally, the Hasmonean kingdom was very small in size. It was restricted to the area around Jerusalem. But over time, the Hasmoneans expanded the size of the kingdom by conquering neighboring peoples who were not Jewish. And they had a policy of forcibly converting those people to Judaism.
Herod's father, Antipater, was a native of Edom, one of the regions forced to adopt the Jewish faith.
Gli Idumei furono posti a una scelta: o convertirsi ai costumi ebraici o abbandonare la loro terra.
The fact that Herod descended from a conquered tribe would plague his entire reign.
There were plenty of people who looked at Herod and said, he's not Jewish enough. And if anyone wanted to find something to level against Herod, then that was a very good reason.
However, Herod's father was a man of great influence, establishing relationships with Rome, powerful ties that would one day ease Herod's ascent to the throne.
Antipater, Herod's father, was an amazing political genius.
Antipatro, già in quella circostanza, comprese il bisogno assoluto di essere alleato dei Romani, una superpotenza imbattibile. Ed egli mantenne la fedeltà nei confronti dei Romani fino alla morte.
Herod's father amassed influence within the Hasmonean royal circle, but the country had descended into civil war. Two brothers, Hasmonean heirs, were locked in a dispute over the crown. The younger of the pair began mustering the nation's military, hoping to control the region.
He seems to have been far more of a firebrand and far more ambitious, and so he asserted his claim to the throne.
Herod's father, preferring a monarch that could be manipulated, sided with the eldest, Hyrcanus.
Secondo sempre la narrazione di Giuseppe, questo Ircano II era un uomo abbastanza inattivo, pigro, una persona che dedicava agli interessi pubblici scarso interesse, al contrario del fratello, che era un uomo attivissimo e che faceva di tutto per farsi, diciamo così, eleggere re.
The war between the Hasmoneans would have dire ramifications. Both sides turned to an outside power to settle their dispute, initiating Herod's ascent to the throne. As war raged in Judea, the general Pompey campaigned in nearby Syria, the Roman Republic's frontier. Both Hasmonean rivals sent bribes to Pompey, each asking he support their royal claim. Rome seized the opportunity to secure influence in Judea.
So Roman interest in Judea is primarily tied to Israel's unique location along the eastern Mediterranean. It's a very important section where you have trade routes moving north and south.
Provisions to feed Rome's empire passed through Judea, but the Romans truly prized the region's strategic position.
Parthia is Rome's great rival in that region. It's the only other empire that can challenge Rome.
The Roman interest in holding the area of Israel was to protect themselves against these Parthians from the east moving into the Roman Empire.
The Hasmonean request for interference provided Rome with a foothold in the region, and Herod's family would bridge the two empires.
The Romans did something that they always did. They chose the weaker one. They wanted the most direct possible control, so they put in Hyrcanus II, and they knew darn well that that meant Antipater, who had very close relations with all kinds of Roman big shots, would effectively be the power behind the throne. He controlled virtually everything.
Antipater strengthened links with the Roman elite, solidifying relationships that would one day benefit Herod. In 47 BCE, Antipater appointed Herod governor of Galilee, the northern frontier of the kingdom. A rebellion soon broke out in the region. When the locals refused to pay taxes to the Romans, Herod's forces ruthlessly quashed the uprising.
He was extremely energetic and efficient. He put down all kinds of rebel leaders, sometimes overstepping the mark, but certainly under Herod, things got done.
But as Herod was earning his reputation in Galilee, his world was shocked into disarray. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated, and Herod's father, Antipater, soon suffered the same fate. The Parthians, Rome's great rival, took full advantage of the situation and invaded. dislodging Hyrcanus from the throne. Herod, a supporter of the displaced Hasmonean, was forced to flee Judea.
Erode era un genio, sia nella abilità bellica che nell'abilità diplomatica. Egli comprese immediatamente che doveva trovare un appoggio per riuscire a sconfiggere questi elementi che si erano impadroniti della nazione.
Herod would convene with his allies in Rome, imploring them to restore Hyrcanus to power. Seeking an audience with the Roman ruler of the East, Herod met with Mark Antony.
Mark Antony is a Roman general who's had a lot of success. He's got a lot of authority from his association with Caesar. He's kind of the main Roman general of the moment.
When Herod came to meet Mark Antony and he presented his position on how to handle the tribes of Judea, he must have come across as an extremely powerful individual with tremendous potential.
Herod explained the conflict in Judea, beseeching Antony to reinstall the rightful powers and ensure that Roman interests in the region were met.
Because Judea is in such a rich section of the Roman world, there's the monetary incentive to keep that trade going, to keep that flow of money coming.
Rome needed a man in Judea that it could trust, and Herod's family had been loyal.
He's in the right place, he's gone to the right person, and he is doing something which puts Rome's interests up at the forefront.
Herod was nominated as King of Judea and equipped with an army to win the throne.
It really demonstrates Roman strength because they get to say, no, we don't think it should be the dynasty that's been there for a couple of centuries. We think this guy should be king now.
Either Herod knew that he was there to become the king, and he went with a plan to get the Romans to make him king, or possibly Herod went there just trying to get help from the Romans to save his situation, and by the time he walked out of the Senate chambers, he was made the king. My bet is he knew what he was doing. This guy was a very clever guy.
Proclaimed King of Judea, Herod accompanied Antony to the Capitoline Hill, where they would seal their union.
The temple on the Capitoline Hill, the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, is the most important temple in the whole Roman world. And it also represents the center of their polytheistic beliefs.
Before the statue of Jupiter, Herod bound himself not only to the Romans, but to their deities.
The Ten Commandments include a prohibition against the graphic representation of any kind of god, any kind of living creature.
Jews, on the one hand, would have been offended by this type of action. But on the other hand, some of them may have very well understood that this was a form of kowtowing for political purposes. I think Herod's view was that the future of the Jewish people was tied up with becoming a client state of the Roman Empire.
Herod returned to Judea with the might of Rome in tow, and for 3 years he battled his way to the capital.
Herod is sent in with Roman troops who are a really formidable fighting force. They've been professionalized for decades now, and they know how to take almost any region.
Jerusalem's defenses were not easily overcome, but the Romans eventually broke into the city, claiming it for Herod. Although the Romans considered Herod the ruler, the Jewish populace of Jerusalem were of a different mind.
Herod's greatest challenge, something which he cannot overcome by force of his personality or by demonstration of violence, is the fact that he is fundamentally not Jewish.
Erode aveva assolutamente bisogno di legittimare la propria posizione di fronte agli ebrei, a causa della sua origine molto discussa e discutibile. Soprattutto egli aveva a che fare con una buona parte della popolazione che rimpiangeva il governo degli Hasmonei.
To solidify his claim as king, Herod demanded the hand of a Hasmonean princess. Hyrcanus's granddaughter, Mariamne,
She was, to all accounts, we have Josephus's accounts, a very attractive woman, delightful person, and according to at least the main line of this story in Josephus, he was over the moon.
Herod had a significant attachment to Mariamne as a human being. On the other hand, the constant nagging doubt that perhaps I'm not good enough, perhaps I was only able to affect this relationship because of my political might and my capacity for military action, perhaps that's really what caused all of this to come about.
Josephus wrote,
"She was in most respects sensible and faithful to him. Yet in her nature she had something that was as feminine as it was cruel. For she treated him contemptuously, as befitting the enslavement he was under by his passion for her."
Mariamne would bear Herod 2 heirs, but he would amass 9 other wives, producing at least 14 children. Questions of succession would forever rock the palace, fueling Herod's paranoia. Although Herod had joined with the Hasmonean line, he feared their influence over the people.
All the way through his life, Herod seems to be paranoid. He's always looking over his shoulder, wondering where the next uprising is going to come from.
In 31 BCE, Herod laid trumped-up charges of sedition against Hyrcanus.
He's seeing uprisings around every corner. He just can't rest because he's constantly thinking that somebody is plotting against him.
Removing any possible threat, Herod ordered that the ruler his family once supported be strangled. The era of the Hasmoneans, a family that ruled Judea for over 100 years, had come to an end. At the age of 36, Herod was the unchallenged king. The Herodian dynasty was now at hand. However, Herod was still far from being accepted as the true monarch by his Jewish populace. Determined to achieve a name that would echo throughout time, as a client of Rome, Herod couldn't pursue conquest and expand his kingdom. He needed another way to ensure his name would prosper.
If you can't run wars, then what you have to do is build. Herod built a lot outside of Judea. He contributed to building projects around the Mediterranean, including in Athens, but he also built quite a lot in Judea, and this was the way he was going to be remembered.
Because he lived in fear that one day the Jews would rise up in revolt and try to kill him, he built a series of fortified palaces on the frontier of his kingdom to serve as potential places of refuge in case of a Jewish revolt. Masada is the most famous of these.
Herod turned his gaze upon the southwest coast of the Dead Sea, to a magnificent site already fortified by the earlier Hasmoneans.
Masada is a natural mountain that has steep cliffs on all sides, so it's really good as a natural fortress.
Towering over 400 meters, the site was practically impregnable, but Herod prized luxury as much as he sought security.
Inside the fortified area on top of the mountain, Herod built his palace, or actually more accurately, 2 palaces.
Now what Herod did was to turn Masada into a beautiful, brand new, state-of-the-art palace with running water toilets and all kinds of things that nobody would believe, with these beautiful, beautiful plastered walls with paintings on them, frescoes, and to create this tremendously beautiful place.
Today, the top of the mountain just looks very dry and brown and monochrome, but in Herod's time, the southern part of the mountain, which was not built up, was cultivated with gardens, so there were fresh fruits and vegetables being grown on top of the mountain.
Transcending a statement of modernity and opulence, Masada signified Herod's unbreakable bonds with Rome.
Herod's palaces on top of Masada include Roman-style bathhouses, with Roman-style heating systems for the bathhouses. They were decorated in the latest Roman fashion, and the palaces were also richly provided with lots and lots of stores of food, including imported wine from different parts of Italy and the Mediterranean.
To facilitate Masada's vast array of amenities, cisterns atop the mountain held nearly 750,000 liters of water, originating from nearby riverbeds that were generally parched throughout the year.
In the winter, on very rare occasions, when there's a lot of rainfall in a short period of time, flash floods flow through these ordinarily dry riverbeds, and Herod's engineers built an aqueduct, a water channel that connected these riverbeds with the side of the mountain of Masada. And so cut into the side of the mountain are a series of gigantic cisterns, which were filled by flash flood waters by way of this aqueduct.
If Herod had simply been a great builder, perhaps his name would have been remembered with prestige. But the darkness in Herod only grew as he aged, exacerbated by a domestic situation that was fast deteriorating.
Herod's long and eventful rule was plagued with palace intrigue of the highest order. I mean, it's very hard to imagine much going on in Shakespeare that would challenge the kind of stories that come out of Herod's rule.
Herod had a sister called Salome, and she's an interesting character because of all the women at court, she seems to have been the one with the most power and prestige.
The name Salome, that's similar to the word shalom, which means peace, but this was not a very peaceful woman.
She utterly hated Herod's wife, Mariamne.
She thinks she's an arrogant, trumped-up troublemaker in the family who doesn't give due respect to their golden boy, Herod.
Whenever an ember of suspicion regarding the threat of the remaining Hasmoneans flickered in Herod's mind, Salome was present to fan it into flames.
Salome was also a very power-hungry individual with the same kind of internal insecurities about her legitimacy. His relationship to Mariamne was something that she resented and constantly plotted against, and was frequently involved in trying to position herself in such a way that Mariamne would ultimately be destroyed.
Salome not only resented the queen, but also Mariamne's brother.
Mariamne had a brother called Aristobulus, and she was very keen that he should have some position, and so she pestered Herod to make him high priest.
The high priesthood was one of the most important positions in Jerusalem. On the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, the high priest would enter the sanctuary inside the temple and pronounce the name of God. Upon hearing that name, the Jews would bow down in submission.
Aristobulus III was the brother of Mariamne, a legitimate Hasmonean high priest candidate. Herod appointed him in order to show that he wanted to continue the traditions of the Hasmonean line.
When Aristobulus III made his public appearance as high priest, he was received by massive Jewish welcoming crowds who were very enthusiastic, according to Josephus, and that made Herod realize that they wanted Aristobulus and they didn't want Herod.
It was clear that all the people really loved him. He was handsome, he was only 17, he was a Hasmonean. He stood for everything that Herod wasn't.
He saw the unbelievable support that the people had for this high priest, and he feared that they would prefer to bring back the Hasmonean Empire, kick him out, and make Aristobulus III the king.
Herod had a plan to rid Jerusalem of his potent rival. After the Feast of the Tabernacles, a celebration commemorating God's provision during the Exodus, he invited Aristobulus to his palace, where they would continue the festivities.
According to Josephus, Herod kept plying him with drink and telling him that Herod meant him no harm, they were all friends together.
Herod obviously cannot simply hire a hit on Aristobulus without provoking the kind of popular revolt that he so fears.
As the sun beat down, Herod encouraged the intoxicated Hasmonean to take a swim.
On the other hand, he can perhaps engineer it that when he's engaging in a swimming exercise, which does pose a certain amount of risk, Perhaps something could happen underwater. Maybe he caught his foot on something. Who's to say the will of God?
Herod's cohorts held Aristobulus' head beneath the water. Within a year of his appointment as high priest, Aristobulus was dead.
The city of Jerusalem, upon hearing the news, was in very great grief. Every family looking on this calamity as if one of themselves was slain.
I think the murder of her brother would have seriously affected Mariamne. I think she must have realized now that Herod is systematically killing off all of the Hasmoneans, and her position was starting to look rather precarious.
Mariamne cursed her husband, knowing full well that he had orchestrated her brother's death.
He tried to pretend it had nothing to do with him, it was an accident, but people kind of had their suspicions.
The ramifications of Herod's actions spread far beyond the palace. Mark Antony wrote to Herod, ordering he come clear himself of involvement in Aristobulus' death.
Mark Antony calls Herod to the carpet and says, hey, how could you do this to Aristobulus? He was a popular guy. I know that you set your own tone in terms of how you rule the region, but we still have to represent the rule of law.
Before debarking to meet with Antony, Herod left his servant Joseph in charge of the kingdom's affairs and gave him secret instructions.
Herod had a very strange habit. He didn't trust his wife Mariamne at all. So on several occasions, he left instructions that if he was killed as a result of the Roman protest against his behavior, that she should be murdered.
Herod explained that his love for the queen was so great, he could not bear the thought of her being pursued by another if he died.
Now, exactly what this was supposed to accomplish is not really clear. But he suspected, I think, that she herself might be behind attempts to have him removed.
With his queen under lock and key, Herod prostrated himself before Antony.
Josephus tells us that he basically talked his way out of it. He's a very good talker, Herod.
When speaking with Mark Antony, he certainly told him that rulers have to do what rulers have to do. And if they've got competition within their circle from somebody who has a better claim on the basis of descent to be the ruler, then it makes total sense to murder such a person. And I'm sure Antony agreed.
Nevertheless, the fact that he has to go there and explain himself shows us, I think, the power relationship that's going on, that Herod can't just act in any way that he wants.
Antony was placated. Herod's dominance in Judea translated to Roman dominance. But back in Jerusalem, Herod's marriage was continuing to unravel. Joseph was frequently meeting with Mariamne to discuss the kingdom's affairs.
Whilst Herod was away, Joseph was continually telling Mariamne how much Herod loved her, and finally he even told her that Herod loved her so much that he'd left these instructions that if anything happened to him, she should be killed.
Joseph, overzealous to demonstrate the king's affections, went so far as to mention the instructions he had received.
Mariamne, though, didn't see that as a sign of love. She was horrified that he would leave instructions like that.
Mariamne recognized the depths of her husband's cruelty. Upon Herod's return to Jerusalem, the palace was awash with rumors of a love affair.
And things were stoked up by Herod's sister Salome, who kept accusing her of adultery.
Herod, jealous of power in every form, is insanely mad with the idea that somehow Mariamne learned of his plan to execute her. And he realized that the only way that Joseph would have divulged this information is if he were in fact intimate with her.
Herod was violently disturbed by the accusations against his wife. He confronted her, but she vehemently denied any wrongdoing. Eventually, Herod's affections overcame his distrust.
You can tell from his interactions with Mariamne that he is constantly insecure about his true relationship to her.
On one level, the marriage was certainly strategic. It was good for him to marry into the Hasmonean line. On the other hand, though, Josephus suggests that it was more than that Herod was almost beside himself with his love for her. It was a kind of a possessive love, and it was this possessive jealousy in the end that drove him to destroy her.
Meanwhile, the Roman triumvirs, Octavian and Antony, each heirs to Caesar's power, were locked in battle. Naturally, Herod threw his support to Antony, but his fleet was defeated at the Battle of Actium. Octavian assumed the name Augustus and became the first emperor of Rome.
And Herod's in trouble, because Herod was a client of the guy who's now out of business. And Herod feared tremendously that he would be replaced, even worse, killed, because he had supported Mark Antony. So he does something that he was expert at. He changes sides.
He seems to have a very good line in being able to say, I just respect whoever I regard as leader of the Roman world at one particular time. It's the Roman state I'm loyal to. So when Antony was there, he was the leader of the Roman East. Of course, I paid homage to him. Now it's Octavian, I'm happy to turn to you.
Herod's gambit paid off. Augustus doubled his territory, returning lands once stripped away by Antony. Augustus reinstated the Cyprus copper mines, granting Herod a significant share in the profits.
And Herod walks out of that meeting ready to continue ruling with great, great success. And actually, before you know it, he's going to start some of his biggest building projects.
In the areas where Herod's population was either non-Jewish or largely non-Jewish, he built for them Greco-Roman style cities, like Caesarea Maritima on the coast, which he named in honor of Augustus.
The former Phoenician naval station was awarded to Herod in 30 BCE, and he immediately began transforming the city.
Renaming it Caesarea after the family of Caesar is really a statement that now he's got this strong link with Rome. I can't imagine this went down well with absolutely everybody on the ground in Judea.
Herod built an enormous temple that was dedicated to Rome and Augustus.
Augustus was to be worshipped as a deity, and Herod upheld pagan beliefs in his city, carrying the name of a god that walked the earth.
This again makes that connection with the Greco-Roman world stronger, because you can see it everywhere around you. It's one thing to say it and put it on paper. It's another thing to be walking amongst it daily.
Herod provided the Gentiles with entertainment venues and a theater that could seat 4,000.
The theater, by the way, in the ancient world is like synonymous with houses of sin.
So this was a thoroughly pagan, Gentile city. It was one where Roman citizens would have felt perfectly at home.
The Caesarea aqueduct brought fresh water to the city from over 10 kilometers away.
One of the things that people took for granted in good Roman-style cities was a constant source of fresh water being brought in by aqueduct, which was used then to service bathhouses and water fountains with fresh water that flowed throughout the city.
However, the construction of these facilities paled in comparison to the harbor.
In order to have trade with the rest of the Mediterranean, you had to have a significantly sized harbor to accommodate major ships. The harbor at Caesarea was the largest artificial harbor that had ever been created up until that time. It is a real feat of engineering.
The coast of Caesarea offered no natural harbors. If Herod was to establish a trading capital, he would need to conquer the sea itself. To reduce the impact of waves upon anchored ships, he forged breakwaters, underwater barriers.
They were created by using the latest Roman concrete technology. This was a kind of hydraulic concrete that was made using a special kind of volcanic ash from Italy, which, when mixed with water and then poured, will harden underwater.
Herod's engineers sailed ships into the Mediterranean, where they mixed the concrete, pouring it into large wooden frames.
The concrete then, once poured into the wooden frames, sank to the bottom of the sea and hardened.
Herod could enforce his will upon the land. His Hasmonean princess, however, was becoming increasingly less malleable.
One evidence of the amazing sort of ongoing intrigues between the Hasmonean line and Herod's family is an anecdote that comes up in Josephus's Antiquities about a love potion.
Mariamne refused to sleep with Herod. He had systematically killed her family and laid precautions for her own destruction. If ever she once favored the king, her affections had withered. Salome, aware of her brother's marital problems, seized the opportunity to orchestrate Mariamne's downfall.
Salome gave her attendants a potion and told them to take it to Herod and say that it was a love potion from Mariamne.
With the seemingly harmless brew, Salome planned to ignite Herod's highly suspicious nature. When the potion was presented to the king, Herod was intrigued. Had Mariamne's feelings changed, supplying him with this aphrodisiac? But when Herod inquired as to the potion's actual contents, the cupbearer said he did not know.
And that just stoked things up even more, making Herod think that Mariamne was actually trying to kill him.
Convinced that the potion contained poison, Herod became violent and ordered that the servant be tortured. Salome's deception worked just as she had planned. For his role in the conspiracy, the cupbearer was executed, but Herod permitted Mariamne to stand trial. The court felt that the winds of favor had shifted away from Mariamne. As the priest hurled accusations, even her greatest supporters abandoned her. Josephus wrote that she went to her death with a demeanor assuring the onlookers of her noble lineage. The sentence would haunt Herod for the rest of his life.
And thus died Mariamne, a woman of excellent character, both in chastity and in greatness of soul. But her principal source of failure was to please the king and to live with him harmoniously.
As the years crawled on, Herod aged with the weight of his guilt. As a distraction, he became further devoted to perpetuating his name through monumental architecture. His gift to the Jews and grandest enterprise was the construction of a new temple on an unprecedented scale.
Herod wanted to show the role of the Jews in the Roman Empire. And that role was going to be shown by building what became one of the wonders of the world. This amazing, amazing, massive building that symbolized in its beauty and its glory the Jewish connection with God, but also the role of Jews within the Roman Empire and their belongedness in that empire.
Josephus tells us that it was built over a period of 10 years by priests, and that during that time, it only rained at night so that construction could be carried out during the day. So who knows, how accurate that is.
The temple was the heart of the Jewish world, and rebuilding it would require dismantling the old temple. Massive amounts of earth were moved, and rocks weighing up to 40 tons were brought to the site.
He had the money, the power, and he actually succeeded in convincing the various Jewish priests and sages to go along with this project, despite their suspicion of him. The Talmud says that they were so suspicious that they made him bring all of the materials for the new temple before they'd let him take away the old one. But the job got done, and it was an amazing structure.
Jews across the ancient world would make pilgrimages to the temple, their spiritual beacon. But debate continues as to whether Herod was permitted to approach the inner sanctum.
There was a balustrade which surrounded the inner temple itself, and that balustrade had inscriptions on it, of which 1.5 have been found, that prohibited people coming in who were not Jewish. Herod, being a descendant of Idumeans, was thought by some to be non-Jewish.
Herod hoped that the new temple would improve his popularity, placating Jews still reeling from the Hasmonean deaths.
La costruzione del Tempio da parte di Erode è sicuramente, per certi versi, in controtendenza all'idea che noi abbiamo di un Erode che non era molto interessato alla religione ebraica. Facendo questo, però, egli diventò un benefattore anche per il suo popolo e si mostrò attaccato alla religione, fece qualcosa di bellissimo da un punto di vista religioso.
However, neither time nor acts of piety could keep the memories of Mariamne from haunting the king. Although his bride was long dead, Herod sunk deeper into madness.
His love for her is so great that he can't accept it, that he becomes depressed, and that he can't even go on. And in fact, what this means is that this was a very sick person. He hated her so much that he could literally have her executed. And yet, at the same time, he loved her so much that he couldn't live without her.
According to one later tradition as well, he had her body embalmed in honey.
The Talmud, the central text of rabbinic law, tells how Herod would frequent Mariamne's corpse, preserved in honey so that the flesh would remain supple.
That this is not out of character with Herod's otherwise bizarre behavior, particularly towards the end of his life, as the mania and his paranoia began to take over.
Whatever you make of these stories, there's clearly this tradition that Herod bitterly regretted what he'd done. She was the love of his life, and he'd killed her.
Herod's grief was only surpassed by his escalating paranoia.
Towards the end of his life, Herod sees plotting everywhere, and the scope of his vision extends right up to his own family circle.
He thought that his sons were trying to undermine him and his rule through various contacts in Rome, but also by that time he had decided that his older son from a different wife should in fact be his successor.
When Mariamne's sons tried to win the support of the army, Herod ordered they be strangled.
The Romans had several times tried to make peace between Herod and his sons. They even thought that they had succeeded, because to them, the idea of killing one's own son was as horrible as it is to us.
Upon hearing the deaths of the Herodian heirs, Augustus Caesar stated that he would rather be Herod's pig than Herod's son. Herod's name continues to resound in infamy to this day, not only because of the systematic elimination of all those around him, but an order of atrocities recounted in the biblical New Testament.
The Gospel of Matthew mentions the massacre of the innocents. When Herod hears that there's a new king been born in Bethlehem, he orders the killing of all the male babies in the area.
I think it was a natural thing for the gospel writer Matthew to attribute this massacre of the innocents to Herod, because he was such a likely candidate, so concerned about his own position, killing rivals, that sort of thing. It's just that Josephus says nothing about it.
And that is quite significant, because Josephus gives a very full account of the end of Herod's reign, and he's very keen to tell us any stories of Herod's atrocities. So what seems to be happening in the story in Matthew is that the author wants a villain. Matthew wants to set Jesus up as a sort of second Moses. So in the same way that the first Moses was threatened by the evil Pharaoh, for Matthew, Herod plays the same role. He is the evil archetypal villain. And of course, people would believe that of Herod. It was the kind of thing he might have done.
Herod's behavior was, however, becoming further deranged. At length he would go into the desert, simmering in his own anguish. With enemies abounding at home, Herod's sense of security was so diminished that he sought to bolster his ties to Rome. Above the temple gates, Herod placed a symbol of imperial might, the Roman standard.
Herod placed a Roman eagle on the temple to provide a decoration that indicated that this fantastic temple building that he had built was a part of the Roman Empire and the Roman world.
Well, the Roman eagle is the ultimate symbol of Rome. It's on all of their standards, and it's a symbol of Jupiter. This is kind of a symbol that Rome has arrived. They'd be very happy with this.
But for the Jews, it was a reminder that they're part of that Roman Empire, and that in fact, they are a people who is subjugated to the Roman Empire.
The resulting uproar was inevitable. A group of young Jews scaled the gates and tore down the sacrilegious image. In swift response, Herod had them burned alive.
To say that any temporal power has authority in that holy ground, those are grounds for rioting.
Because of these intrigues and violation of divine law, towards the end of Herod's life, he began to suffer very badly. And Josephus describes this in gruesome terms.
He had an itch and swelling of the private parts, and there were worms and gangrene and a stench. And it's a really disgusting description of Herod's end.
Fire glowed in him slowly. His entrails were exulcerated, and the chief violence of his pain lay in his colon. When he sat upright, he had a difficulty of breathing, which was loathsome on account of the stench of his breath.
The point of the story is to show that Herod, who was a really bad, nasty, cruel man, suffered justifiably from a really cruel, nasty, agonizing illness and died of that.
Grasped by sickness, Herod had already laid plans for his resting place, building another magnificent fortress on the outskirts of Jerusalem.
It's the only site that he named after himself because he intended it to be his final resting place. All of the other sites that he built, he named in honor of someone else.
And he built this most incredible structure there, taking advantage of a natural hill to create this, what looks like a volcano.
But you can see in Herodium all kinds of evidence of the greatness of Herod's power and his building skill.
The effort that must have been expended to create this is mind-boggling because there was originally a sort of a low hill or mountain there, but Herod built it up by building concentric circular walls and then having dirt piled around the outsides.
And he could see for miles all around. It was a safe place.
Herodium also had another advantage because it was close to Jerusalem, but it wasn't Jerusalem. If Herod built other places because they had either strategic value like Masada, or they had economic and other importance like Caesarea, he built Herodium so it could be a guest house where people like him and Roman visitors could, so to speak, let their hair down when they come to Jerusalem, because in Jerusalem there are all sorts of restrictions because it was the Jews' holy city. And when you go to Herodium, you're on Roman turf.
On the edge of death, Herod still had a final act of brutality to perform. He instructed Salome to round up 70 Jewish elders and imprison them. They were to be slaughtered upon the moment of his passing.
And then, of course, there will be mourning in the land. Everybody will be mourning somebody or mourning these great figures who've died. Nobody, of course, is mourning Herod, but that's not the point.
But his final command would go unfulfilled. Once Herod died, Salome released the prisoners, hoping to preserve her brother's legacy. Herod's death uncaged the Jewish hunger for independence, and the kingdom quickly erupted into riots. As the Romans deployed legions to quell the land, Augustus divided the kingdom among Herod's 3 remaining sons. Throughout his rule, Herod managed to keep Rome at bay, but over the years, the empire would tighten its grip on Judea and milk the kingdom for its wealth. The abscess left by Herod sowed the seeds for the Jewish revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem over 70 years later. During Herod's 37 years of Roman-supported rule, he constantly endeavored to gain legitimacy in the eyes of the Jews.
Herod began by trying to legitimize himself by marrying into the Hasmonean family and preserving its privileges and its status as best as possible, and eventually discovered that it wasn't possible.
He could do some of the most wonderful things. And he could build great public works and a fantastic temple of God and murder his wives and children. So you have here a very strange kind of person. It's not possible to classify him.
A slew of executions and biblical myth often obscure a lifetime of achievements.
He managed to keep stability in a very difficult context for many, many years. He managed to keep off direct Roman rule, and in many respects, his reign was a success.
There's no single individual who built more and who left more of a lasting mark physically on the country, a lasting physical imprint, than Herod did.